I'm over the moon to be joined by Baroness Shami Chakrabarti, who needs little introduction, but who many of you will know as a Labour peer, as the former Shadow Attorney General, and of course as the Director of Liberty for 12 or 13 years, I think, Shami. A very long time. And when I was thinking about all of the people that we should be speaking to about the current situation that we're in and who can we learn from most, Shami was the number one person that came to mind for so many different reasons, but particularly because of your experience in campaigning and standing up for human rights in the most difficult circumstances in the wake of 9/11. And maybe we can jump in right away there, really, in that terribly difficult context. It's always difficult to stand up for civil liberties and human rights, but never more difficult than then, and perhaps now. If I recall correctly, and full disclosure, we worked briefly together. I was very lucky to work at Liberty for a time under Shami. If I recall correctly, Shami, your first week of work was directly in the wake of the September the 11th attacks.
Yes, that's right. The 9/11 was, I think, my second day in a new job as a lawyer at Liberty. And prior to that, I'd actually worked on anti-terrorism measures in the Home Office. So I'd been a lawyer in the Home Office for about 5.5 years before coming to Liberty. So that was a big culture shock in itself. And then to exacerbate that culture shock, as I say, on my second day at work, 9/11 happened. I talk about it a little bit in my first book. It was literally new environment, having come from the Home Office, from an interior department charged with interception warrants and extradition warrants and anti-terror legislation and immigration legislation, all the rest of it, to be on that side of the fence, so to speak, and then to come to Liberty, but then in that new environment very quickly. And I literally had a day to think about the challenges of the new work. I'd been asked to develop a campaigning litigation strategy for Liberty. So one day of blue sky thinking, if you like, and then the next day there were blue skies no more. And it was very clear that our priorities were not going to be of our own choosing. They were going to be set by governmental responses on both sides of the Atlantic in particular.
And your campaigning in those subsequent years led you to be called anything from the most dangerous woman in Britain to the most inspiring political figure, which I think is an apt reflection on how difficult and divisive, oddly, campaigning for human rights can be in these times.
I mean, I think you're so right, Silkie. I think that the lesson, if there is one, to other human rights campaigners about either acclaim or derision is really, I'm not the greatest fan of Kipling for all sorts of reasons to do with his politics, but I do think treat those two imposters just the same is a pretty good motto, because you're derided, you're praised, depending on who you're upsetting and who you're defending. And in my experience, whatever they say, everybody actually loves human rights. They love their own. It's just a little bit harder to stand up for other people's, particularly people who you don't identify with or you see as the bad guys. It's easy to stand up for your own rights, those of your friends, family, people like you. That's the bit of liberty that everybody loves. It's the others, the marginalized, the suspect, the the left behind, and we don't often enough identify with those people until we find ourselves on the wrong side of that border, that fence, that wall, that line.
That's so true. And the current terrible circumstances that we're in with this pandemic are really showing up lots of, on the one hand, it's been called the great equalizer, but really it's been anything but. And it's really showing up a lot of the fissures that we have in society, and the different risks that people face. Some people have even described there as being the kind of ingredients for class war. But what's without doubt is that there are certain people who are at more risk than others, certainly people in care homes, older people, and then of course people who are still having to go out to work on front lines, whether it's bin collectors or NHS workers or construction workers and so on. How do you read this?
Yeah.
The most important right being the right to life. How do you read that challenge that we now have with protecting some of the most marginalised people in the country?
I think you really nailed it. The great equalizer comment is something that really belongs in Madonna's bathroom
and nowhere else.
With the greatest of respect to the great entertainer, I think that has been proven to be false. I understand where it's coming from. It's coming from the recognition that we are all human, and there is an element of connection in that, particularly when we're talking about, an infection, a pandemic, a crisis, not in the financial system, but literally in the respiratory system. And of course, you are much more protected in the White House or in your penthouse than you are in the places that you've described, on the front line, in the care home, in the shelter, in reliant on public services of whatever kind that have been deprived of priority and investment for a decade. So of course it isn't an equalizer. The sentiment comes from a good one, which is we're all human. We need to take care of each other to take care of ourselves. But the truth is that in any crisis stroke emergency stroke moment of massive national and international struggle, some suffer more than others. And crucially, to go back to the point about I love my liberty, I love my free speech, but yours is more expensive. Crucially, it is incumbent on human rights campaigners, I think, to level the playing field, because otherwise some people are making all the decisions and other people are paying for them. Some people are literally prepared to sacrifice others for not just for their own benefit, but for their own convenience. So to give an example, in the war on terror, a lot of people were very happy to sacrifice the liberties of a minority. So let's have racial profiling, people would say, at the airport, where those same people became a little bit more squeamish about a loss of liberty was when you saw it affecting them or affecting everybody. So people, for example, very happy with compulsory identity cards when it's just going to be for, asylum seekers. But when it might be everybody, then suddenly people start weighing the costs and the benefits of the policy a little bit more carefully. Similarly, in a financial crisis, of course, bail out the banks, and the very good reasons for bailing out the banks, because the banking system is important to any society. But bail out the banks, and then what about the people who've suffered as a result of the banks and the bankers? A bit more reluctant to take care of the people lower down the economic chain. And this time I'm hearing similar voices getting, you might call them right-wing libertarians, who get very upset about not being able to take their preferred holidays and drives to beauty spots and get their Labradors out of their Land Rovers and all the rest of it, but not prepared to stick up for people working in care homes or people in care homes, so even sort of, really quite elderly retired judges, for example, banging on about the police state because of the need for lockdown and social distancing, but not suggesting there should be a symmetry, an equalization to any sacrifices. And literally some of them talk about, well, let the old and the sick shield themselves so that the rest of us can go about our business as usual. And I find that, as I say, reminiscent of the same attitude of othering, letting some people suffer most, some people sacrifice most, that we've seen in previous crises, emergencies, and even in wartime.
I think I know who you're talking about, but of course there is something about the enormous wave of emergency powers that there now are, and the lockdown restrictions that affects everyone in a way that policing and authority haven't affected some of those groups, and very privileged groups before as well. Do you think that will change people's understanding, perception, experience of policing, and maybe even of kind of grow people's consciousness of the importance of their own and others' civil liberties?
There's no doubt that this is the point about equal treatment, both in terms of how you feel when you've had a bad experience, when you've previously led a very charmed or privileged life, but also about the discipline that equal treatment as a principle will impose on people like the police and on government. And that's why it is a very, very important human rights principle. You said earlier, and I understand again where it's coming from, the most important right is the right to life. I see where that's coming from, but I'm not completely convinced that it is actually the most important right, because if you think about it, the right to life doesn't grant us a right to live forever. You can't have, jurisprudence can't do that. You need something more spiritual or even magical to do that. I mean, the right to life is incredibly important, but it's not an absolute. So we take life in wartime, or we take life to save life when somebody's about to murder people, etc., and there is no other choice. You'll actually find that the right not to be subject to torture and human degrading treatment is more absolute. But I think in terms of the key to the human rights kingdom, the key to really building a society that respects everyone's human rights, equal treatment is in a way, non-discrimination or equal treatment is the most powerful dynamo. If you think about it, in the Belmarsh case, the judges didn't, the judges of it was then the Lords Appellate Committee, it would now be the Supreme Court, didn't in majority choose to interfere with the government's decision about, what was strictly necessary, was it a public emergency? What they did was look at the differential and discriminatory treatment between different groups of suspects based on their nationality, and the judges said, but this isn't rational. This is irrational discrimination, and therefore it cannot be strictly necessary. And similarly, I think you're right. When people who've previously led a charmed life, as many of us have, certainly in comparison with other parts of the world, it's when we have that little taste of injustice or oppression or intrusion that perhaps we think again about the rights and freedoms of others. I can remember, for example, Conservative members of Parliament who had their own little brushes with the police, then saying to me, I will never take civil liberties so lightly again. And I now identify with young black men on council estates who are getting stopped and searched on a routine basis without suspicion. So out of some oppressions, some good things can come when people, learn what it's like to be on the rough end of the stick. That's not, by the way, wanting people to experience injustice, but it's another reason why equal treatment is so important. Because if authorities or other people in power are allowed to divide and rule, including by sacrificing some people's liberties so that other people can enjoy them freely, it does divide and rule, and minorities get othered, and it's and in any event, without even expressly discriminatory laws or enforcement, lockdown is harder for people who are poorer, for people in crowded housing, for people who can't afford or can't get access to food deliveries, for people who've got prior poor health and diets, and so on and so forth. So you're starting with something that isn't really an equalizer, something that hurts some groups worse than others, which is why it's even more odious when some commentators write freely in the newspapers, speak openly on the BBC about the importance of just letting those people shut themselves away and let other people live as before.
The lockdown restrictions, as you've just said, they have incredibly complex impact that needs to be debated and properly considered. Obviously, there's the time pressure of the urgency of the situation that we're facing, but there has been very little of that. And so, for example, the lockdown regulations, so to speak, the health protection regulations, were only considered by the House of Commons, I think, at least 7 weeks after they were imposed by government. And then I guess must have been in the 8th week that they got to the House of Lords for consideration. Now that you're on that side and you have the ability to work in Parliament, and yet we've seen these regulations being made that have such profound impact, but Parliament seems to have been kind of swerved in the scrutiny of them. Does that concern you?
Of course, it's always very concerning. It was concerning when I was sitting where you are, and it's just as concerning, even more concerning now. And it is very frustrating to see sometimes the almost impotence of even a massive legislature when you get emergency legislation of whatever kind. And of course, regulations are even less easy to scrutinise than primary legislation, though even the primary legislation that was the Coronavirus Bill Now Act was put through so quickly. And at a moment where you have a government with an 80-seat majority in the House of Commons, where the second chamber lacks elected democratic legitimacy, and of course where there is a very real emergency, not a metaphorical war like the war on terror, but a very real emergency, as opposed to just a threat or a challenge or a very grave threat or challenge. It's a global pandemic, and you've also got a parliament that can't sit in its usual ways because it's sitting virtually or semi-virtually, etc., etc. But I would say that regulations and the ability to scrutinise them are always a slightly less than optimal mechanism. And I think that emergency legislation, even of the primary variety, is passed too quickly. So the government sits on the problem for some period of time, months or weeks, and then says, well, we must have this through in a matter of days. And then, subject to the size of its majority and subject to the emergency and the public mood, it sort of can do all of that. And again, my biggest concern about the legislation is that it's asymmetric. That on the one hand, it and I argue, I said this to to ministers and in the media at the time, I can understand the justification for pretty much, all the measures in that legislation, horrific though some of them are. Really, the idea that I would ever support the banning of mass gatherings, which by definition includes peaceful protests against the lockdown itself, the idea that I would ever support that, and I did, the idea that I would support the possibility of people being sectioned under the Mental Health Act by one doctor, not two, given the dangers there, and so on and so on. The reduction in rights for the chronically disabled and people in need of care plans and so on. It represents a huge potential degradation of rights, but in the kind of emergency where those things might be necessary. So you suck that up and you say, okay, this is a global pandemic. We're already, I think, nearly on a casualty figure that's about half the civilian casualties in the whole of World War II. Imagine that, 70,000 UK civilians perished in the whole of World War II. And now we're in the early 30s, just in a matter of months. So I accept all of that, but my concern is the asymmetry of the legislation, because you've got all these sacrifices that individual citizens and people in the country have to make in relation to their rights for this period. But where were the powers to requisition factories to produce PPE? Where were the powers to ensure that health and safety was properly enforced? So lots of powers for the police to move you on when you're having your ill-advised picnic or your trip to the beauty spot or whatever it happens to be. And you see those stories now, and sometimes I see Silkie Carlo, rightly quoted, and sometimes somebody less articulate and sympathetic is quoted. But you see those stories, but where are the stories of the health and safety executive going into an unsafe warehouse or call centre or construction site with the police? So individuals' rights are being... Sorry. So it's asymmetric.
So I was going to ask.
Yeah.
So do you think the emergency powers are more punitive than they are protective?
No, I think that they are designed to be protective, but they're not. But they're asymmetric. So it's sacrifice on behalf of the individual, and of course that will mean in practice the poorest individuals suffer the most because of the nature of having a garden, not having a garden, etc., etc., etc. But equally, where are the parallel powers that we should have seen to clamp down on unscrupulous employers and ensure health and safety, not just in the parks but on the building sites or in unsafe places of work? So sacrifices on behalf of individuals, and that will mean the poorest the most, but not sacrifices on behalf of people who are making literally millions and billions out of online retail, and possibly forcing their employees to work in unsafe conditions.
I think one of the disappointing things about the lack of time that's been afforded to parliamentary debate around both the lockdown restrictions and, of course, the Coronavirus Act as well, which has massive sweeping powers in so many areas that you named a few, but it's 342 pages. It's eye-watering stuff. Is that precisely the kind of issues that you're raising now haven't really been raised enough? And I think a lot of people are worried, and particularly because now these are issues that affect everyone, and that is unlike other issues that we've worked on before that tend to disproportionately affect some groups and then kind of leave other people almost untouched. The emergency powers here directly affect everyone, although in different measures, as we've discussed. We've certainly had a lot more contact from members of the public, people who are just not even just worried, but alarmed scared, writing to their MPs, looking at this legislation going through, and the lockdown restrictions, and wondering what is the role of Parliament in this? It seems to be very executive heavy, ministerial decree. Do you think that Parliament, our British parliamentary democracy, is surviving this emergency situation well, or do you think things could have been done differently?
Well, I think that it's probably a little too early to tell, but we are dealing with the challenge that comes from an executive heavy system anyway, right? So that, we know that, parliamentary, the fairy tale of parliamentary sovereignty is often executive domination in reality. There have been some moments of pushback, often with the help of the courts, as in relation to the illegal prorogation of Parliament, which now seems like a decade ago, but believe it or not, was only last autumn, which is extraordinary, wasn't it? Do you remember last year, where everybody was a sort of barrack room constitutional lawyer, and this year everyone's an armchair epidemiologist? But yeah, that's the sort of timescale that they were working under. So there've been for many years now, we've seen an attempt at executive domination of Parliament, and there's a real question about whether the constitution is really robust enough in the face of that. But on top of that, we now have an 80-seat majority for the government, which will only, exaggerate that challenge. On top of that, we've got the physical constraints caused by the global pandemic, such as it not being safe for the House of Commons and the House of Lords to operate in their traditional way. And I'm not convinced that they're currently achieving the same degree of challenge and checks and balances via the virtual system. That's not to say that it might not be possible to develop into something more robust, but that creates a further challenge still. And then, of course, here's the problem. During the war on terror, I have no doubt that many of the measures that were adopted weren't just sort of unnecessary or disproportionate. They were positively counterproductive. I have no doubt in my mind that things like internment and the greater use of sweeping stop and search without suspicion powers and summary extradition and snoopers charters and whatever, I have no doubt that they probably recruited more terrorists than they prevented. But I'm not able to say the same about the current situation, where though the legislation contains some really chilling powers, like nothing we've seen, probably worse than in World War II in terms of the powers, what I'm not able to do is to point to a single one of them and say that that particular power may not be necessary in a particular part of the country during the spread of this pandemic. So that's a great challenge still. And then we've got the problem of the asymmetry, yes, being partly in the legislation itself, but it's being exaggerated by the economic and health circumstances of people. So, the war on terror as a metaphor, I never accepted, by the way, because I thought it was so dangerous, because terrorism, awful though it is political violence, and it's been a part of the human experience forever. Yeah. And so I was always saying, what are we going to do? Just wait for some politician to tell us that one more push and the war on terror is over. That'll be forever. And in the meantime, we just sign away our rights and freedoms. But this is different, because with the global pandemic, it is not a metaphor. It is very real. Just look at the death count. But on the upside, Silkie, we will be able to see the progress in terms of the deaths going down, and hopefully when we get proper tracking and tracing, we'll be able to really see with our own eyes the infection rate going down. At some point, we will see the greater rollout of all of that, but we will also see a vaccine. So it doesn't have necessarily the same grave danger of a metaphorical war on terror that just goes on forever. Plus, as you say yourself, the measures, though they're disproportionate in impact, are having some impact on everyone. And what I'm concerned about now as we head out of lockdown is this attempt yet again by some people to discriminate and differentiate in the sacrifices that people will make. So some super wealthy people are very, very keen to get out of lockdown. The sooner the better. But what they're really doing is sending more ordinary working people potentially into unsafe conditions at no cost to themselves, if anything, to improve their stocks and shares.
The war metaphor is so interesting, and in the rhetoric around the current pandemic, it has been used. There's been a lot of talk about fighting the virus, or winning a war against it, which I think for many reasons is misplaced. But I do wonder, and I might just challenge this a bit, that there is a risk of longevity here, isn't there? I mean, we know still relatively little about the novel coronavirus, but it seems quite likely that it will mutate, that there will be other strains, it won't go away, it will be a constant risk. And maybe even it will instill ways that we as a society manage, whether it's serious flu outbreaks or other kind of health challenges like this. Do you really think there's a world in which we can have this amount of change that we've had over the past 2 months, say, the emergency laws, the massive social shifts, and that would you confidently say that you think those powers in their entirety will be revoked kind of when this is done, whenever that is, and that we'll go back to a kind of relationship between the citizen and the state that we had before?
I think it's definitely possible, but it will take a lot more than politicians' promises or our goodwill and aspiration. Apart from anything else, the way out of lockdown and the way out of these chilling measures is very directly, in part, about huge investment in healthcare and social infrastructure. So if you look at the jurisdictions elsewhere in the world that have been most successful and at fighting the virus, or at keeping deaths down, and then potentially ways out of lockdown, you're looking at the health systems that invested, and that invested in particular in things like testing and contact tracing, and then isolation. And if we massively reinvest in healthcare, in PPE, in social care, in nutrition, in public education and public health education, you can take your foot off the authoritarian pedal. And that is definitely the way that I would want to go as a healthier choice for people's health, but also for our rights and freedoms.
It always seems that there's a foot hovering over the authoritarian pedal, and in times like this, it's very easy just to put the foot down and go full throttle. And alongside those measures that you just mentioned that will help us reclaim a kind of sense of normal and ensure that this doesn't become a new normal and that people are safe and their lives are protected, some of what has been asked of people is that we make trade-offs quite directly with our rights, and in particular privacy has been one of those rights. So we know, for example, that government has been asking mobile phone networks to share location data on a mass scale, or some kind of tracking data on a mass scale, but we don't know at what scale. We have very few answers to those questions. We've got big tech companies who are predictably lobbying now and working their way into the NHS. Palantir, for example, Amazon, Microsoft, all in the NHS, and then the contact tracing app that's being done in a centralized way. I think one of the things that we learned from the post 9/11 environment is that these emergency measures, particularly where privacy is concerned, tend to endure, and they tend to stay and even expand. And as you mentioned earlier, the Snoopers Charter is a really good example of that creates a new normal. How much do you think, I'm interested to know how much, you personally, having worked so much on those privacy issues, how much this concerns you, and also how much it concerns your colleagues, how much appetite you sense that there might be in Parliament to be looking at these issues seriously, so that we don't become a country that's constantly under drone surveillance, with censored apps, immunity wristbands, and all this kind of dystopian stuff that seems very much on the horizon, if not the doorstep.
I think you're really right to single this aspect out in particular for being one of the aspects of the crisis that could have, without extreme vigilance, very long-term consequences. Just as the war on terror nearly became the justification for compulsory ID cards, which we saw off, but actually became the justification for all kinds of surveillance in any event. And I spent years fighting ID cards, and here I am talking to you with various products, and goodness knows you're always very good at this stuff, Silkie, and I'm less technically aware. How much do I really know about the security of these communications? And you're quite right that there is a trade-off with privacy, but there always has been, because we're individual creatures and social creatures. Things like privacy in particular have always been complex, but no less precious for that. In fact, you have to be more vigilant, not less vigilant, with a so-called qualified or balanced right, almost, than you have to be with an absolute right, like the right not to be tortured. And so what we need is more transparency from government about what they're actually up to and what their trade-offs are with big tech firms who aren't necessarily getting on board for the good of humanity, or the good of fighting the virus. They are after people's location data and other intimate data for reasons of profit, not necessarily reasons of public good. Because if you think about it, it's like these online retailers. They are no doubt providing a very useful service to a lot of people right now, but they're not necessarily treating their employees that well in the warehouses. And the same is true in relation to all the big tech that want to get on board and have wanted people's health data for a very long time. So what we need is transparency about the design and the processes and the deals and the monetization. We need to have a proper public debate about what the checks and balances should be. And we want to see necessity, proportionality, and this stuff has to be in accordance with law. I want to know where the primary legislation is going to be that authorises the taking, holding, and processing of this data. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate demand. And it will only boost public confidence if the public are involved in that debate. And that is what should have happened about all sorts of intrusions in the past, because we do accept, don't we? We all accept that we give up a bit of privacy for the purposes of fighting crime, of the enforcement of tax collection, etc., etc. You cannot collect people's taxes if they aren't forced to tell you what money they have. You cannot investigate crime without intruding to some extent on people's privacy. And the same is true, I have no doubt, about fighting a pandemic. But we want to see the checks and balances. We want to see the necessity and the proportionality of all of this. We want to see that people aren't being discriminated against. And we want it all to be out in the open and subject to law, and laws that we debate and make.
Yeah, it seems like, unfortunately, because we're already so far down the road where surveillance is concerned, that that's come back to bite us. I think because there hasn't been transparency and scrutiny, sometimes not even legal frameworks. I mean, ANPR, for example, a massive system of road surveillance, which we saw police turning
with no legislation. It just developed. It just developed. Do you know what's really interesting though, Silkie? Some people who are now making these sorts of noises are sort of rather unusual suspects. I don't know if you read a piece by Jonathan Evans, the former director of MI5, in I think the Telegraph a few weeks ago. He was actually saying something along these lines, or not that far away from them, that if you want to take people with you in relation to some of the surveillance that you might need, or some of the data collection and processing that you might need to fight the virus, you need to learn the lessons of the war on terror and do more of this policy making in public. And then people can, and that is the way to make the trade-off, because otherwise it's always, whether it's with our physical health or whether it's with our privacy, the danger is in some people taking the risks and making the decisions, and other people paying the price. And that's true whether it is your health protection, which is really important, or whether it is your privacy, which is also important. And it's a complete false choice. I've always believed this, to say to people, you have to choose between your life and your privacy, or you have to choose between your economic protection and your health protection. This is nonsense. If somebody was in your home, you wouldn't ask them to choose between sharing the meal or being allowed to speak at the table. You just wouldn't separate their dignity in that way. And I think that's the kind of thinking we need when we're looking at society as a whole.
I agree, and there needs to be much better. There needs to be, or in some instances, any legal frameworks for some of this stuff, and certainly much better oversight. I think Jonathan Evans has been a really interesting.
So go ahead.
I think Jonathan Evans has been a really interesting voice in this, and certainly in calling for more. For the public to be more engaged and have reason to put more trust in rapid technological development. His report on AI and algorithmic decision making was very good. But I wonder if sometimes we almost can't see the wood for the trees. I mean, there's the legal frameworks are one thing, but what we often are not having a public debate about is, do we want this stuff in the first place? How much do we want this? And then, even it kind of dawned on me in recent days, especially now that we're all isolated from one another, that because we are so far down the surveillance road, everything we do currently leaves a data trail that is either exploited for commercial gain or in most instances surveilled and goes into government databases. That includes this call, every communication we have on our phones, every email, every purchase we make on Amazon or wherever else, everything we watch, all the
I so agree with you, and I so agree with you. I rail against it every time I see that, because I have made, I'm such a tin hatter in some respects. I'm not on social media, for example. I'm not on Twitter. You won't find me on Facebook, Twitter, etc., etc. But I have made online purchases, and I have bought, films to watch at home. And the moment you do that, they're sending me things that I might like to watch and I might like to buy, and that's and which telegraphs to me that they are they are monitoring my my habits for their own corporate purposes. But it is nonetheless chilling to me. And to some extent, this is me, the civil liberties campaigner who fought this stuff when it was the government doing it. But when it's big business doing it, I'm sort of falling in. I'm just falling into line because this stuff is so convenient and this stuff is so cool.
Yeah. And we have little choice at the moment because of the situation we're in. I'm also not suggesting, by the way, that we all go and retreat to the woods.
No, I know you're not, and
that would be quite nice.
Yeah,
but I'm just thinking about the way.
If there were alternatives. It would be nice if there were alternatives. And maybe this will come. It would be nice if there were entrepreneurs and people who said, here's a streaming service. Here's an online retail service that does not hold the data. Now, the trade-off will be that you won't be able to buy the same basket of shopping next week, and I'm not going to send you little nudges about books that you will also like, or films that you will also like. But what you will know, if this is what you care about, is that your information, your habits are private, and nobody would want to. But if you think about when you walk into a physical bookshop or library or cinema, how would you feel if there was somebody sort of just filming you and recording, which bookshelf you browsed at, which bookshelf you actually took from, you would find it creepy. You would find it absolutely creepy. And yet we all let this happen by this method, myself included.
Well,
and you can tick every box. You can tick every box, subject to your own technical ability. And by the way, that's another way in which we're not equal. We're not equal in our access to broadband, for example, let alone in our affinity with understanding the technology. So that's a problem that needs addressing in terms of resource and education and so on. But even with quite a lot of access and ability, we're making these trade-offs, and we're making them without a genuine choice sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my major concern is that it's really about mission creep, and about how in the wake of crises like this, yes, obviously corporate surveillance has evolved, but we have massive lurches forward in government surveillance, and that often isn't in accordance with the law. But
and there's also a relationship. There's also, the public-private thing isn't even divided anymore, because you've got government and corporates working together. You've got massive private prisons, and you've got the government, particularly in this crisis, having to go to big business for help with everything from pharmaceuticals to surveillance. So it's not even as simple as saying public good, private bad, or the other way around, depending on your politics. Right. It's really about power. It's about powerful entities of whatever kind. And I'm not saying that they're all wicked, because they're doing things that we want them to do on the one hand, but there's insufficient transparency, there's insufficient accountability, and insufficient public engagement in the decisions. And when you try to ask questions, and this is why it's important, I think, that organisations like yours are doing what you're doing, because people sometimes feel that they can't. Situations like this, a bit like the war on terror, to ask questions is to be unpatriotic or even treacherous. Now, if you look at the debate about schools going back on the 1st of June, and by the way, this can be whether you're advocating freedom or advocating protection, and of course the two are interlinked. So you could be somebody who's arguing to lift the lockdown, or you could be somebody who's arguing for more caution before the lockdown is lifted. But you speak out of turn, you ask some difficult questions, and suddenly you're not a patriot, you're not doing your duty, you want people to die. All of that rhetoric that we've seen in previous emergencies. And I think that is really problematic. And to some extent, I think the discourse is even more toxic now than it was after 9/11, because of the rise of a certain style and tone on social media in particular, and because of the Brexit, the Brexit debate that's so polarized and toxified politics to some extent. So you see it with this debate about whether schools, whether some primary school children should be going back on the 1st of June. To even ask questions about the scientific data or about how it's going to work is to be, I don't know, a lazy teacher or not a patriot, etc., etc. So I think that's, that is concerning. And what we must all do, I think, is at least fight for the right to question and the right for a slightly more civil debate, so that dissent is not disloyalty, particularly in time of crisis.
I wanted to talk about the impact that the emergency powers have had on the integrity of the rule of law. It's been quite concerning to see the number of unlawful prosecutions that there have been. There have been 44 under the Coronavirus Act already, including some people actually being held in custody. So every single Coronavirus Act prosecution that's been reviewed by the CPS so far has been found to be unlawful. And I think there have been about a dozen under the lockdown regulations. But there have been thousands and thousands of fines issued. And I'm really worried that a lot of those might be misplaced, or that people are paying them because there's not really an effective means by which to challenge them other than risking prosecution. Is this something you're concerned about?
I think it is right to be concerned about all of this confusion when it leads to unlawful prosecution. There's no doubt about that. And I don't believe that most of it is malign. I mean, there's bound to be, in any system of law, there's bound to be abuse, but a lot of inconsistency and even illegality will come from just the confusion of emergency legislation of a criminal nature, and law enforcement being just behind and not getting sufficient clarity from government and from those at the head of law enforcement. There's no doubt about that. And I do think it needs to be looked at. And I think there needs to be a culture in government and at the top of, prosecution and police agencies of saying, okay, we weren't perhaps adequately prepared for this global pandemic. We're playing catch up, but what we are going to do is have a hard look at how this happened, to ensure that we're better equipped in the future. And if necessary, that means apologising to people. If necessary, that means reviewing guidance. If necessary, that means reviewing the actual law. But we have to take the public with us, and the public, have given actually a lot of support to the authorities in this pandemic. And I think they've done it for good reason, generally speaking. They've done it because this wasn't a metaphysical threat. This is a very real threat. It's an invisible enemy, but it is a real one. And to some extent, I think the war metaphor is better here than it was in the war on terror, even though this isn't called the war on coronavirus. Some people might call it that. And the reason, and it's really interesting because people said the British public won't wear this. It is said in the media in some places that one of the reasons why the government was perhaps a little later to lockdown than it might have been was that it feared that the British public wouldn't wear it or wouldn't wear it for a lengthy period. And I think that's probably proven to be untrue, or not to be borne out by the evidence, which is that people have made enormous sacrifices. But I think in return, these same people are entitled to some hands going up and to some lessons being learned, and being learned openly and transparently, so that if necessary, apologies can be made, compensation given, and guidance, practice, and even the law, if necessary, amended. And there's no shame in that. But of course, too often the culture is to hunker down. We never made a mistake, and we never got it wrong. And I think that just whole culture is problematic in itself.
Do you think, just going a little bit more into the lockdown itself, and this is a difficult area, and it's fraught with controversy and all the rest of it, so I put this kind of that prelude on it.
Sure.
But do you think there's a risk that some of the length or the extent of the restrictions that are in place are somewhat kind of patching over pre-existing failures, that the NHS, the real purpose for the lockdown initially was to protect the NHS specifically, to make sure that it was going to be able to deal with the number of people suffering. But does that mean that we are kind of surrendering liberty to protect the NHS, the ability of the NHS, which has been systematically underfunded? I think it's just fair and sort of objective to say, for years. And then other failures, for example, to source PPE, the kind of practical failures around handling the crisis.
I think to some extent that's correct. I think, and I don't mean to be a controversialist, I'm not even trying to play a blame game. I just think that calmly and dispassionately, there is no doubt that some elements of lockdown were either required or required to a greater extent because of our lack of preparedness in terms of things in particular like testing, tracing, and isolation, and then things like PPE and so on. If for example, do you remember reading, I don't know, at some point in February, which now seems like a decade ago, about some people who'd come back from their ski trips and their business trips, and were they prepared to sign a contract before they got on the plane and sit voluntarily in quarantine in the Wirral? It is possible that if as soon as we, this is counterfactualism, right? And there's no point in it to some extent, except that to learn lessons for the future, we ought to try and learn from it. There's no doubt in my mind that with greater preparedness, greater investment in the NHS, greater stocks of PPE, but in particular, if we'd stuck with testing, contact tracing, and isolation. And I know that there are civil liberties aspects to contact tracing, for example, but I think we can agree that it would be possible to devise a system of contact tracing that protected people's privacy as well as protected their lives. If we'd stuck with, checking people when they came into the country, and with an element of community-based testing and tracing and isolation, we might not have needed the scale or viciousness of the lockdown. I mean, I may be wrong about that, but if you look at it from the other end of the lockdown, a lot of people seem to be saying that it would be easier to take the foot off the pedal and come out of lockdown with greater confidence if we had the testing, the contact tracing, and the isolation in place, because then you wouldn't have to have the global lockdown, the national or massive lockdown. You'd actually be able to tell who needed to isolate and who could be back out at work. And if that's true on the way out, it seems to me in logic that it might have been true. It might have been true on the way in as well. Now, we don't have a full picture because there isn't transparency. We get certain things mooted in Sunday newspapers, certain leaks and briefs, and who knows. And no doubt a blame game is already beginning in Whitehall that won't necessarily make transparency any easier. But I do think there's something in that. That doesn't mean that we wouldn't have had to make sacrifices, because this is a very real virus. You know, that people had to make sacrifices in relation to HIV/AIDS, you know, in relation to their intimate lives, in relation to their, their drug use and other, behaviours, and that came with a great deal of stigma, and so on, that this pandemic doesn't need to come with, though some are already trying to get xenophobic about it, which is, I think, a mistake in more than one country, I should add. But yes, sometimes there is no doubt, and this was true with terrorism as well, sometimes you pay in civil liberties for a lack of economic and other practical investment.
Yeah, without doubt, there were different ways of going about this and dealing with it, and we've seen lots of different approaches, even across Europe. Of course, Sweden is the outlier, and something that I've certainly experienced and heard a lot from people who are concerned about the current situation that we're in terms of the lockdown and loss of liberty, is that there was no debate about that it seems that it was taken as a given that that Britain's way of dealing with this, and the way that UK would deal with this, is by going into a full lockdown and kind of not really questioning then, are we paying the price for failure to fund the NHS or to stock PPE and all the rest of it.
But the irony is, I think there was a debate. It just was, it was happening behind closed doors, and we weren't included in it. That's the problem. That, of course there was a debate. I mean, to some observers and journalists, it looks as if there wasn't just a debate; there was a U-turn. Some people are suggesting that at some point in early March there was a U-turn or handbrake turn, or what, I don't drive, but some kind of dramatic turn, and that. And look, I don't know the answer to this because I'm not privy to what goes on between the Prime Minister and his closest advisors, but some commentators are suggesting, on the basis of leaks and briefing and so on, that there was a dramatic change of strategy from, if you like, a more Swedish approach to the lockdown approach. But I think there's also this issue about preparedness. Years of austerity and the impact of that on healthcare and social care and preparedness and resilience, and in particular this thing about testing and tracing and isolation. Because if you're saying that no, we're going to contain, and we're going to be able to carry on life generally as normal, because we can spot the virus and we can pinpoint who has it, and we can quarantine them, and take care of them, and that way you have to test and you have to trace and you have to isolate, and that just seems logical to me. But at some point, not only did we move from what some people were talking, when people do you remember when people were talking about herd immunity?
Yeah.
And which was always a little bit chilling to some, because using animal metaphors is always a little bit uncomfortable. But some people were banging on about that. Other people were saying, well, that's just awful. You're going to sacrifice the elderly and the vulnerable and so on and so forth on the altar of your economic attitude and status quo. Then they said, no, herd immunity is not a strategy. It's just something that's going to happen. That was never our strategy. But we do know that the lockdown came quite suddenly. It came earlier than anybody was expecting. It came suddenly, and the testing stopped.
Yeah,
but community-based testing stopped, and then we were told, well, actually, there's a capacity problem, and that has come from ministers have admitted that they couldn't do as much testing as they would have liked to, because they didn't have the capacity. And that is the evidence that you need, that to some extent we have been making trade-offs between money and human rights.
Yeah, and it's this, I guess, that brings me back round to the question about the role for Parliament in all of this. The fact that such fundamental questions about the lives and liberties of everyone in this country were happening with unelected advisors behind closed doors, not with a sovereign parliament who have been, kind of allowed a look, allowed a 2-hour debate about the lockdown 2 months after it happened, allowed to make a statement as 340 pages of the Coronavirus Act went through, which completely renegotiates our civil liberties and confers extraordinary powers to ministers and authorities. It's wonderful that you're in Parliament as a champion for civil liberties and human rights. I wonder, in which seat did you feel, and I'm sorry if this is a slightly painful question, I have to ask it, an honest question. In which seat do you feel that you've had more influence? Is it as in your campaigning capacity or now in Parliament?
Well, it's not painful. It's just difficult. It's not pain.
It's painful for me to ask it. I'm sorry.
No, not at all. No, it's not painful at all, because influence is very difficult. Influence is difficult to measure. I think that because it's influence, not power. Power to some extent is sort of very tangible, isn't it? You know when you're the Prime Minister, and you know that is power, as opposed to, maybe being the leader of the opposition, for example, let alone being somebody else. But I think that influence is a much more sort of mercurial thing, because sometimes you don't even, particularly as a campaigner, you don't necessarily even know the strength of your influence and the ripples that dissipate and then cause other people that perhaps you haven't even met to be motivated to to act in a certain way. But what I can say is that I don't think that Parliament has been particularly muscular during this crisis, partly because of the arithmetic and the timing. It followed quickly after a general election. I mean, I think that that the Southeast Asian countries were first sort of communicating with the World Health Organization on something like New Year's Eve. We'd had, in our political life, we'd had this tumultuous general election, government with massive majority, demoralized opposition, just tumult, and therefore, and all of those things suggest a weakening of checks and balances on a triumphant executive. And I'm not making a party political point. It's just whoever's in the executive, that would be the case with that kind of story. And then we don't have sufficient transparency, and I don't think that anybody properly gripped the gravity of the situation until it was almost too late to give the kind of scrutiny that you would have wanted to both the legislation and the nature of the lockdown. And I think that both were necessary, but the things that could have made them less necessary or made the extremities less necessary needed to have been looked at probably months, if not years before, in terms of both investment and planning. Now, this is all counterfactual, and it's not said on my part, and I don't think it's asked on your part, in order to bash the government or write an alternative sort of fiction. It's about trying to learn, not just for the future in other crises, but for the further handling of this one. Because, for example, what is the plan for the autumn and the winter? What if there's a new spike after a certain easing of the lockdown measures? What if what if the autumn or the winter brings a new wave? What if it takes longer than we would like and hope to get a vaccine? All of these dilemmas are going to continue and exacerbate. And what I would say is that as human rights folk, we don't have magic solutions, but what we have is a sort of compass that helps with the navigation a little bit. And it's principles like necessity and proportionality and non-discrimination, and legality, transparency. These are the sorts of things that I think we're right to ask for. But I would say ultimately it's that even-handedness that is so important. We cannot have some people making all the decisions behind closed doors, or because they have the command of the airwaves, or they have the newspaper columns, and other people sort of paying the price. And that's paying the price both with their livelihoods and their jobs, but also paying the price with their mental health when they're isolated in lockdown, or actually with their lives when they're frontline NHS staff, care staff, transport workers, and all of those people, because they have human rights. They have human rights too, and they have literally paid the ultimate price. As I say, at the moment we're into 30-something thousand, and that is not a metaphysical war rate. That is nearly half the total UK civilians that were lost in World War II.
Yeah, these are truly extraordinary times, and I do fear this is just the beginning, and we may very well see a second wave. But certainly, what we will have to do is enter this kind of new world, the post-pandemic world, where so much is being renegotiated. Our expectations of civil liberties, various kind of social norms. We've got these emergency powers to deal with, and of course the health crisis, which will change as time goes on. But I'm so glad that you continue to advocate for human rights and civil liberties in Parliament.
I'm really glad that you're there and Big Brother Watch is there, and that we're all, even in this dystopian moment, we're able to come together even by this sort of space oddity type technology.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I really want to say thank you on behalf of so many people. Just also for everything that you've done to advocate for human rights for so long. And I've really learned a lot speaking to you just now, even drawing those comparisons with the battle for liberty that you for so many years in those post 9/11 years, and in the most difficult circumstances. You've certainly inspired lots of people, me included, to try to be fearless in the work that we do, and to continue doing it in difficult circumstances. So
you're doing great, and the feeling's mutual, and thanks for everything that you're all doing.
Oh, thank you, Shami. And I wanted to say as well, I brought up the Coronavirus Act several times, and you humbly didn't acknowledge how much work you did on that, and scrutinising it, and pushing government to put the 6-month review in, which, as we discussed in the circumstances, was quite something, because it was a very limited time frame. And we'll see in 6 months now, thanks to that.
Well, it was a small thing. It was a small thing, but actually, under the circumstances, it was small, but maybe something.
Yeah, exactly.
Never enough. The problem with all of this, and you'll know this from your own work, is that it's never enough, and it's never over. But we keep doing what we're doing, and it's really hard, but it's worth it. And both the point of it and the joy of it is the same thing, and that is other people. That they present us as these sort of selfish, rights obsessed libertarians, but we're not. We're actually all about other people, because that's what it's all about. It's not selfishness. It's what it is to be human, and to have each other as social creatures, but also to have our dignity and our freedom.
Absolutely. Oh, I couldn't have put it better. Thank you so much, Shami.